Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku.
This is Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. And Science Fantastic, we profiled the amazing, jaw-dropping scientific discoveries which are revolutionizing our world and touching our lives. And in this hour, we're going to talk about medicine. We're going to talk about the ethics of medicine. With us today is one of the nation's leading bioethicists. His name is Dr. Arthur Caplan, professor of bioethics at New York University. Graduated from Brandeis University, got his PhD at Columbia. He's authored 30 books and 600 research papers in the field called bioethics. Bioethics is the merger or the boundary between biology and medicine on one hand and ethics and politics on the other hand. I first heard about Dr. Arthur Caplan in the controversy about gene therapy. Is it possible that one day we can change our genetic heritage, eliminate fatal genes, for example? If you are Caucasian, you have to worry about cystic fibrosis. If you're African American, you have to worry about sickle cell anemia. If you're Jewish, you have to worry about Tay-Sachs. Is it possible that one day we can actually alter our genes to eliminate the 5,000 genetic diseases which have haunted the human race since the dawn of humanity? Or, for that matter, what happens if someone misuses it? What happens if people use gene therapy for cosmetic reasons, just to be prettier, or to have an advantage in school, to be smarter and have better powers of concentration? Or athletes. Should we allow athletes to genetically modify themselves? Would you pay money? Would you pay money to see two teams of athletes just to find out who's better genetically enhanced and has more money to pay for the latest genetic treatments? I mean, we're talking about ethical questions now. Who pays for this research? Who benefits from this research? And what does it mean if one day there are renegade genes that we cannot control that enter the black market? You know, we can't control the drug market. What happens when illegal genes start to enter the black market? You can spread illegal genes simply by the internet. You don't even need to have drugs that are easily picked up using blood tests. So all these things comprise something called bioethics. And today we're going to talk about the Zika virus. What's behind it? How bad is it? Should the Olympics be canceled as a consequence? And what should the average person do faced with the Zika virus? We're going to talk about sperm banks. Have you heard about the scandals involving sperm banks, which are largely unregulated? That is, one person with schizophrenia disguised the fact that he had schizophrenia, and his sperm was used on many women. Only later they found out that his biography was bogus, and it's not regulated. Or for that matter, look at all the anti-aging creams that you get in a drugstore. You may say to yourself, well, this is snake oil. Why doesn't the FDA regulate it? Well, it turns out it can't. Believe it or not, these anti-aging creams and potions, perhaps they're all fake, all bogus, but they can't be regulated because the FDA doesn't have the power to do so. And we'll also talk about cancer research. Did you know that there's some real, honest-to-goodness breakthroughs? Breakthroughs that are reproducible, testable, falsifiable, breakthroughs that have met the standard of science. Immunotherapy, actually boosting the immune system of the body for real. Of course, there are a lot of bogus charlatans out there saying that if you eat carrots or whatever, you can boost your immune system to fight off cancer. Wrong. Now let's talk about how scientists can really boost the immune system. And then we find out the fact that cancer is just not one disease. It's perhaps hundreds, thousands of different kinds of diseases. You realize the human body has about 200 different kinds of tissues. Each tissue in turn can be mutated hundreds of times. And do the math. We're now talking about perhaps thousands of different kinds of diseases, all collectively called cancer. So, but however, as I said, there are some real breakthroughs being made. Immunotherapy is one. Another is liquid biopsies. Wouldn't it be great to simply have a simple blood test or eventually a urine test or saliva test, and the test results come almost immediately, and they tell you that you have cancer growing in your body, and you will get a tumor in a few years. This is coming. Think about that. The word tumor might even disappear from the English language. Okay, well, these are some of the topics we'll be discussing today with Dr. Arthur Kaplan. He's a professor of bioethics at New York University, and you are listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. In this hour, we're going to be talking about some of the biggest stories in public health. And with us today, once again, is Dr. Arthur Kaplan, perhaps the nation's leading bioethicist. And he's the William F. and Virginia Connolly Mitty Professor of Bioethics at New York University. So today, we're going to be talking about the Zika virus. We're going to be talking about sperm banks. We're going to be talking about cancer research and all the headlines that you've been reading concerning medicine. So, Arthur, glad you could be on Science Fantastic.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, first question that we always ask our guests is, how did you as a youth first get interested in science?
Well, it's interesting. Unlike you, I wasn't really drawn into the physical sciences, but I had a huge interest in medicine, and it was because when I was a little boy, I was one of the last people in North America who had polio. People can barely remember that disease, but it was a paralyzing disease. It often paralyzed your lungs and your diaphragm, the muscle you need to breathe. And when that happened, you wound up in something called an iron lung, which was a very primitive machine that sort of replaced through pressure the function of the diaphragm. But you couldn't really live in there forever, and a lot of children sadly died. I recovered, but I was in the hospital for 9 months, and I had to go to rehabilitation because if you lie in a bed for a long, long time, you lose your muscle tone. So I had to learn to walk again. So that was really a pivotal experience, obviously, in some ways. For me, I was a real little boy. I was only 7, but it got me thinking about taking on terrible diseases, what could be done to prevent them, what could be done to treat them.
Okay, and what steered you in the direction of medicine and specifically bioethics? First of all, what is bioethics, and how did you become one of the pioneers in that subject?
Well, this is a somewhat of a connection back to the polio. So when I was there, people weren't telling us the truth as kids. They'd say Johnny went home, but it was clear that Johnny hadn't gone home because we all knew he was dying, and they wouldn't tell us the truth. You couldn't have your parents stay over at that time. The only thing they managed to get to me when I was in the hospital for that long period of time was my homework. I didn't see my dog. I didn't see my sisters, which wasn't the worst penalty on earth at the time, but at least I would have liked to have seen my family and so forth. So all these ethical issues were coming up, and I'm sure that they fueled my interest not just in medicine, but in sort of how we treat patients, how we treat kids in the hospital, and I'm happy to say we've had some improvements. But that gives you an idea of what bioethics does. It tries to look at how are we dealing with patients? Do we give them the appropriate information? Do we get their consent to do things, whether it's research or therapy? Do we protect their privacy? Do we treat them with dignity and respect? Do we respect cultural and religious diversity? So concepts that listeners will know about, the idea that you have to give your consent before someone does research on you, bioethics helped bring that into practice. The idea that you have a right to know your diagnosis, that comes from bioethics. The notion that you could fill out an advance directive, a written document, and say, this is how I want my end-of-life care to go. If I can't speak, if I can't communicate, or this should speak for me, that was from bioethics. Indeed, I played a personal role in pushing that through. And then we also get into tough questions like if there's not enough medicine to treat Zika or Ebola, who should get scarce medicines, rationing. We get into issues about how far can you go to force people to accept vaccinations in the name of public health. So you're looking across the board at ethical issues at the bedside, and then ethical issues in health policy and research. What do new technologies do in terms of raising issues, some of which we'll talk about, and then day to day, how can we improve sort of the quality of the experience for patients?
Yes, and speaking about polio, I still remember the March of Dimes.
Yes.
TB,
Yeah.
polio, those were things that we had to worry about as kids back in those days. And the March of Dimes was very prominent in terms of raising funds to fight polio.
It was one of the real first, what we would call today, crowdsourced things. No internet, no ability to do it online, but Roosevelt, who had polio, and other political leaders got behind the idea of raising money to take on the disease, and people sent their dimes in. And believe it or not, the March of Dimes Foundation is still around today. Polio hasn't gone away. The March of Dimes has moved on to some other diseases in North America. They deal with Down syndrome and genetic issues and other kids' diseases, but it's still here, and it's based on that foundation from the polio years of the 50s.
Okay. Well, let's just jump right into some of the headlines of today. And one of the big stories, of course, is the Zika virus and the Olympics in Brazil. So first of all, what is the Zika virus and how dangerous is it?
So Zika is a virus that basically can spread through mosquitoes. Sometimes we call them vectors. And there's a subspecies of mosquito that carries both Zika, another disease that listeners may have heard of called dengue, and actually one called chikungunya disease. And these are viruses that get into our body by, as I said, the mosquito biting us. They get into our bloodstream, and then they circulate around. In the case of Zika, if you're a young fetus, the virus can affect your development. We've all seen those terrible pictures of kids born with small heads and deformed brains. This virus actually is somehow capable of getting into the brain itself, which is unusual, but it's a very small and aggressive virus. And Zika can also be spread sexually. So sexual transmission is definitely possible, a little bit like AIDS. It's not a virus that mutates quickly, so maybe we can get a vaccine for it, but we don't have one yet.
Okay, and of course, the Olympics are in the news, and the question is, well, first of all, is it a good idea to have the Olympics and have literally millions of people go to the epicenter, or one of the epicenters of the Zika virus epidemic? Your thoughts?
Well, let me plug an idea here. We just put up a guide to travel to the Olympics, and if people want to see it, they can go to NYU Langone, Langone, Medical Ethics, and you'll go right to the page, and they'll give you lots of information. But assuming you're not doing that right now, the answer is if you're of reproductive age, I'm not sure it's a good idea to go down there. It doesn't look like they're going to postpone the games or move them. That just isn't happening. So they're going to happen. As listeners know, some athletes have decided not to go. Some tourists, a pretty good number, have decided not to go. I think you're at greater risk if you're pregnant and a woman, or if you're trying to have a baby, because the babies suffer the most from Zika. But I would urge people to think hard about whether they're going to travel there if they're thinking about having a child. Certainly wouldn't go there if you were pregnant or might have possibly become pregnant. That's a really dangerous trip to be taking.
Now, some people say that the U.S. is basically perhaps a sitting duck for an epidemic because, of course, mosquitoes are found throughout the United States, especially in the South, and that's how they are spread. So what are your thoughts about how serious it could evolve into the coming years?
So it's dangerous. There are probably 60 countries that have Zika. We've had a couple of cases in Florida. Certainly it's all over Puerto Rico. And here's why it's particularly troubling. Remember, the mosquitoes bite you, and then you can be bitten by other mosquitoes, and it sort of spreads around that way. Or there's this sexual transmission if you have the virus in you, and we know it lasts for at least weeks, maybe months, in people's bodies. One of the difficult problems is you don't really see the birth defects problem until 9 months later. So even with Zika breaking out in the U.S. and Puerto Rico, we're not going to see the results of that, the tragic results, for many more months because people won't have kids for a while, even if they've been bitten in the summer. Congress did something unethical. They didn't spend any money to prevent Zika. What you do is you want money to kill mosquitoes. You want to teach people how to put on bug repellent and make sure they do it frequently. We have some advice on that, by the way, on our website. Wear long clothing. Try to stay indoors in air conditioning, because the mosquitoes don't like air conditioning. They like warm temperatures, not cold. So there are things that can be done. Wear a condom. Don't engage in unsafe sexual practices. But Congress decided in its infinite wisdom, no money for this. And I think that really is one of the great unethical public health decisions that's ever been made.
And once the cat is out of the bag, right, it's pretty hard to put it back. You cannot
tough.
You cannot recall a life form, right?
Yeah, once that thing's circulating, it's moving in the mosquito populations, it's moving in the human populations. And remember, we've got travel. We saw this with Ebola, people going across the continent, so you can move it to places where the mosquitoes may not be there. So even if you live in Alaska or Toronto or Maine, you could still have this appear because of travel, even though the mosquitoes don't like it. The people are going back and forth. So once this, well, I'm going to say it's already out of the bag. I think we're going to have to cope now with the consequences of not doing our best at prevention.
Now, it seems that every week or so we discover new things about this virus. At first we thought it could be contained. It only affects certain populations. Now we realize it can be spread by sex and other means. So there could be other surprises out there, right? We're still in a learning curve. Well, we have to take a short commercial break, but after the break, I want to ask you about the future. I mean, could it really spread? Are there more surprises lurking concerning the Zika virus? And what should people do? Should people buy mosquito net, repellent? What procedures can people take? Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, on the line, we have Dr. Arthur Kaplan, one of the nation's leading bioethicists, talking about the juncture between medicine and ethics. And we are right now talking about the Zika virus. And we should also point out that he is a professor of bioethics at New York University's Medical Center. He got his undergraduate degree at Brandeis College University and his PhD at Columbia University. He was a director of the Center for Bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania, and now he's at New York University. Well, Arthur, we were talking about the Zika virus, but some people say that maybe there are more surprises lurking in the science of that disease. I mean, look at the AIDS virus, right? That turned out to be a lot more difficult and a lot more deadly than anyone ever suspected. So what are your thoughts about the Zika virus? It seems that every week or so there's another surprise.
Let me mention a couple of things that have turned out to be surprises. One is people thought that your body attacked the virus, its immune system, and got rid of it. It turns out that the World Health Organization was saying, look, if you've been in a Zika place, just don't have sex, unprotected sex without a condom for 4 weeks. We've got cases now being reported 60 days of people showing the virus in their body. We don't really know how long it stays in there. I'm not going to say it stays in forever, but I would be very surprised if we weren't actually giving out bad advice. We probably need to say, if you've been exposed to Zika in the Zika area, don't try to have a kid for months. We didn't understand that. And given the outcome, the risk, that's bad. We learned that this virus can cause something called Guillain-Barré syndrome. It's rare, but it's a terrible paralysis that affects our nerves that control muscles. We never associated that with the Zika virus. And we found out that it's not just sex, but you could transmit this through kissing and kind of fluid exchange like you see with other viruses. Didn't really understand that. So we're really learning a lot about this strain of Zika, this particularly nasty one that causes these birth defects in babies. And I don't think we're done learning about it yet.
So in other words, there could be like walking time bombs out there, right? People that have been infected, but they think they're safe, but there they are transmitting the virus to all sorts of people, right?
A little bit like Typhoid Mary, not showing symptoms, didn't know she was sick, but spreading the disease all over the place. And that's one of the real fears I have, is if you bring all these people to the Olympics in a place where there has been Zika, and there are clearly infected people, and they kind of have a party and maybe have relations with one another, then you're bringing it back to countries that didn't have Zika as they travel home.
And what about a vaccine? We don't have one yet, but what are the chances that we can get a vaccine in the coming months to years?
Well, I think the chances are good, partly because unlike HIV, which the virus mutates as a kind of natural defense against the body's immune system, it mutates fast. This one is slow, and why that's so, I don't know, but it's a fairly stable genetic makeup. So when that's true, vaccines work very well. We don't have it yet, but I think there are a lot of clinical trials underway in humans of trial vaccines, and I bet we get one by next year. That's why I was saying it might make sense to postpone the Olympics, because it would be better to do it when you had this vaccine.
Okay. Now, some people say, well, before we had the Ebola scare, and there could be other germs out there lurking that are perhaps even ancient. And perhaps they've been there for thousands of years, and only recently have humans begin to encroach upon their natural territory, which means that as humanity spreads into the jungle, into the savannas and what have you, there could be other diseases out there that will catch us totally off guard. What are your thoughts?
Well, we're certainly getting more diseases moving out because humans are moving into places where animals are. I'm sure that's what happened with Ebola. I think West Nile virus, which used to be obviously in Africa, over here, again because of greater contact with wild places. But it's also transportation. You know, people get on planes, and pretty soon what used to be in one part of the world within 24 hours can be anywhere in the world. And that clearly is part of a transmission that occurred for Ebola. I'm very sure it's part of the reason that West Nile is here. I'll give you one disease we forgot about, an infectious disease that's old. It's our old friend, the flu. You know, remember we were all concerned, 4 or 5 years ago about pandemic flu, meaning just a rapidly spreading form of flu that's especially lethal. Well, that hasn't gone away. We're watching that virus. If it were to, again, undergo some further genetic changes, it could become more contagious and nasty. It's a virus that moves through poultry, sometimes through geese and wild birds, and they spread it all over the place. So we really need to come up with a vaccine there, but I kind of worry that we don't have the resources still to take on these particular public health challenges.
Now, some people think that animals are actually one of the largest reservoirs of these hidden viruses. And, for example, the SARS virus, which caused such a scare in Asia. And, well, you can't get rid of animals, right? So we just may have to live with the fact that as humanity spreads, there are going to be more things jumping out of the forest. Well, we have to take another short commercial break. But after the break, I also want to talk to you about the controversy concerning sperm banks. How safe are our sperm banks? Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. This hour we're talking about bioethics. With us today is one of the nation's leaders in that field of bioethics, Dr. Arthur Kaplan, professor at New York University's Medical Center. He did his undergraduate work at Brandeis University, PhD at Columbia University, and he was the director of the Center for Bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania, and now he's at New York University. Well, moving into another subject, sperm banks, of all things, have been in the news. We had one story where somebody who was schizophrenic, his sperm was basically disseminated to quite a few women who were shocked to find that out. And we have other stories as well. So the question is, are sperm banks regulated? Are we going to find more and more of these scandals?
Well, this is an issue I've been very worried about for decades. And the short answer to your question, Michio, is no, they're not really regulated. They do have rules about screening for infectious diseases, HIV in the sperm, but in terms of whether they keep good records, lose things, errors, and even when a sperm bank is bought and sold, because they are, whether they transfer all the materials and properly identify them, there are no regulations. So a lot of people go and they say, boy, I would like to get a sperm donor, and I think I might get a physicist and someone who's also a great chess player and someone who's a great physical specimen, and I picked them out of a book, and that's who I want to be my donor. Well, that's fine, except people's records in these sperm banks are about as good as 19th century grocery store inventories. That is, they might be written in pencil. There's no standard template. They're not even electronic. Whether that person told the truth about who they were when they were the donor isn't really checked. So a lot of people wind up getting donations that involve people with illnesses that are hereditary, and we've seen that in the story you mentioned and in others. Samples are overused. Everybody says, yep, I want the genius physicist who's also a great athlete, so they use the same sample again and again, leading to incest that is unknown because the children meet each other and they don't realize they have the same father. And I could go on, but it's really an area where we could use a lot more oversight and a lot tougher regulation, both to protect the people who use it and to protect their children.
Okay, once again, you're listening to Dr. Arthur Kaplan, professor at New York University and a specialist in bioethics. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. With us today is one of the nation's leading bioethicists, Dr. Arthur Kaplan of New York University. He's written more than 30 books, more than 600 papers in peer-reviewed journals. He got his undergraduate degree at Brandeis University, PhD at Columbia University, and now he's a professor at New York University. Well, we just had a discussion of what doesn't work, that is all these anti-aging creams that you get at the drugstore. I understand that it's difficult for the FDA to regulate them because they don't penetrate the skin. However, if they don't penetrate the skin, that means they don't work. Which means that they can only advertise their nonsense because it doesn't work.
I think in anti-aging stuff for the skin, I think you're exactly right. It's like spreading fairy dust. If it doesn't get inside any cells, it's not going to do anything. And part of the reason you can sell it is it doesn't get anywhere. In terms of other stuff, stuff that you do swallow or eat, pills and other food claims, again, the FDA doesn't regulate food. They are restricted to devices and drugs and vaccines. That's what they regulate. And so they really just don't have any authority to go out there and say, this stuff is no good. By the way, there's also no control over what's in it. So whether it contains, impure ingredients or dangerous stuff, nobody's watching.
Right. And I saw an interview with a dermatologist who actually said there's only one ingredient which actually works in all the cosmetics, and that is moisturizers, because they seal in the water.
I'll tell you one other one that works.
Yeah?
Don't go in the sun.
Right. The absence
that works
of sunlight.
very, very well.
Right. Well, now let's talk about cancer because, there are therapies which do seem to work. Immunotherapy is getting a lot of publicity, and Vice President Joe Biden has even declared that we need a new moonshot, just like the Apollo program that put our men on the moon. What are your thoughts about the latest cancer research?
Well, it's an exciting time in cancer research, and here's why. We're starting to understand the biological, genetic differences that individuals have that make them more prone to getting breast cancer. We all remember Angelina Jolie's testing and finding out her risk factors before she had breast cancer. We're starting to be able to do it for many forms of cancer. In fact, we're also starting to understand that cancer has many forms. I'm ready to say it's probably a multiplicity of diseases that we've traditionally called cancer, but now we start to understand they have different mechanisms, different kinds of cells, different types of problems, and so we're probably going to have to diversify our understanding of what cancer is. That what's a melanoma is not the same thing as what's going on if you have a small cell lung cancer. So we're starting to understand what puts us at risk, but we're also starting to understand that these cancers make distinctive chemicals when they're in our bodies. And we have some tricks. Some drugs will target those chemicals, known as proteins, that the cancers make and then kill those cells without hurting the rest of our cells. Problem with chemotherapy and radiation is they kill everything, so that's why we have those horrible side effects. But the new generation of drugs says, there's a stealth little cancer cell. It's putting out a tiny amount of a very distinctive chemical. I'm going to go after that chemical so it just kills the cancer cell. What could be better than that? Precision. That's where the precision medicine idea comes from. And sometimes you can actually get the body's own immune cells to go after those same chemicals if you boost them. So all very exciting. We're seeing advances in diseases like multiple myeloma, terrible cancer, blood cancer that's horrible, really starting to get the ability to cure it. Starting to see progress in many, many areas of prostate cancer and other types of cancer. So that's the moonshot idea that Biden is pushing. The time is right. Unfortunately, again, Congress, too cheap. They only budgeted $1 billion. You know, it takes more than $1 billion to do something like get rid of all these forms of cancer. So while I'm not against the moonshot, I would say it's a little bit more like think of it like a single prop plane shot. It's not going to take us to the moon. It's probably going to take us a little bit, but it's not going to take us that far.
Also, what's making news is liquid biopsies. That is a simple blood test that may one day indicate that you have cancer colonies growing in your body, maybe years before a tumor actually forms.
Absolutely.
This is incredible.
So remember I mentioned these tiny little chemicals. Well, you should be able to get them out of your circulating blood, and they're a sign that, something's starting to go wrong, being able to pick that up. We don't have the liquid biopsy yet, but it's coming. It will be here. I'm going to say 2 to 3 years. I'll go out on a limb.
Right, and perhaps it means that you can have an early warning system, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
the drugs that we use now to treat a cancer, some of them are going to turn out to be very effective in preventing a cancer. So you will even see people listeners may have heard of cancer vaccines. Well, you probably could inject yourself with some immune boosters if you were prone to getting a particular kind of cancer and prevent the cancers from even getting a hold in your body.
And what about immunotherapy? I mean, it's effective against certain forms of cancers, but not in general. But what are your thoughts about immunotherapy? That is boosting the immune system.
So boosting the immune system, there have been all kinds of quacks and nuts who've run around saying, take this and it'll boost your immune system. People try to sell us stuff to do that for the common cold. Turns out the common cold is one of those viruses that mutates all the time. We don't know what the heck to do with it still. Still one of our toughest nuts. I wouldn't take an immune booster there. But for things like cancer, the body does try constantly to pick off new cancer cells, and they're actually forming in all of us more than we'd like to believe. That is, these incipient cancers get started, and then our immune system finds them. If you could get that system to be stronger, boost it or help it with drugs, or try to grow more of those cells in the body, I think we could find ourselves starting to be immunized against different forms of cancer.
Okay, well, unfortunately, our time is up. So once again, Dr. Kaplan, thank you so much for being on Science Fantastic.
And thank you for having me.
Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku.
This is Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we profile the amazing, jaw-dropping scientific discoveries which are revolutionizing our world and touching our lives. And in this hour, we're going to bring on one of the nation's leading science writers, Corey Powell, science editor at Eon Magazine, contributing editor at Discover, American Scientist. You name it, he's written for it. And his next book is coming out next year called Everything All at Once, written with Bill Nye, the science guy. And so once again, Corey Powell is going to talk to us today about space, outer space. What's out there in this great universe of ours? As you know, recently the Juno space mission sailed past Jupiter, a bullseye 500 million miles from the planet Earth, and we hope to find evidence of the origin of the solar system itself. Jupiter, the biggest planet in the solar system, dominates the entire solar system. Our Earth would not have been possible unless the planet Jupiter basically plowed the original solar system, cleaned it out like a vacuum cleaner, and here we are today, compliments of the planet Jupiter. Then we're going to talk about Mars. Is it really possible that one day we can set up a colony on Mars like in The Martian? Or, for that matter, what about terraforming Mars? This is, of course, something that may take centuries, but what about the possibility that one day we may actually create a Garden of Eden on the red planet? And you probably heard that Stephen Hawking, my colleague, has come out with an interesting plan to send the first starship, not just an interplanetary probe, but a first starship to the nearby stars. And he hopes to do it with a starship the size of a postage stamp. That's right. You can forget about the Enterprise. It's simply too expensive to send the Enterprise to the nearby stars. But having a computer, a supercomputer the size of a postage stamp, give us all the information about the universe, that's something that is totally doable. And what about extrasolar planets out there? You know that the Kepler satellite has identified roughly 2,000 extrasolar planets. Well, these and other developments, we're going to be talking with our special guest today, Corey Powell, science editor at Eon Magazine. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. In this hour on Science Fantastic, we're going to bring on our special guest today, and we're going to leap into outer space with Corey Powell. Corey Powell is a science editor at Eon Magazine, a contributing editor at Discover and American Scientist. In fact, he was 15 years on staff at Discover, 5 years as an editor-in-chief of Discover Magazine, and he's coming out with his third book. His third book with Bill Nye the Science Guy, called Everything All at Once, which is going to be published next year in May of 2017. So, Corey, once again, thank you so much for being on Science Fantastic.
Oh, well, what a fun place to be. I'm very glad to be here.
Okay. Well, the first question we ask all our guests is, how did you, as a youth, first get interested in science?
Well, I think there was something in my blood or something in my DNA that really from a very young age, I liked classifying things in the world. I liked understanding how things work. Actually, I was very interested in plants when I was a little kid. All the different, you plant different seeds, and a slightly different type of seed produces a totally different kind of plant or flower, and that seemed really amazing to me. And then in second grade, we did a science project. They had a little, Earth and space unit in second grade, and each kid got assigned a planet, and I got assigned the planet Neptune. And I remember thinking, what a ripoff! I don't get Mars where there'd be aliens. I don't get Saturn where there's rings. I get Neptune. Who's interested in Neptune? And so I went home and I read. We had one of those little those golden books. I don't know if your listeners remember. This was back in the days before the internet. There was a very small pool of things for kids to look at, and these golden books were like little primers about how the world works. So I looked up Neptune. I was reading about Neptune. I thought, oh, actually, Neptune's actually pretty interesting. Neptune's kind of cool. There's like a lot of stuff we don't know about it, and stuff we do know about it is kind of interesting. And it's like a little switch went off in my head. It was the moment when I realized that even the things that I didn't know about, that seemed kind of boring about space, had all kinds of cool mysteries to them and all kinds of amazing possibilities. And I just kind of got hooked. I got a telescope. My parents got me a subscription to Astronomy Magazine, which was a brand new magazine at the time. And I just I never looked back. But then, when I got to really at the college level and started considering whether I wanted an academic science career, I discovered that, in fact, I was not that well suited to to scientific research. I loved the discovery process. I loved the process of scientific storytelling. I turned out not to have the kind of patience and intellectual depth that some people like you perhaps have to really stick with the research side. But I discovered that I was actually quite good at kind of communicating the scientific discoveries and kind of acting as a conduit between the research community and the larger world. And that's how I ended up in the magazine world. And I've been there pretty much my whole adult life. So I get to be a fellow traveler with the scientists, and occasionally I've in different ways I've participated in some different scientific projects. But it's been a lifelong passion, and it's been a very, very rewarding journey for me.
Okay, and tell us a little bit about Eon Magazine, because you're the science editor there, and also a few things about your work with Discover Magazine as well.
Right. So I've sort of over the years I've made a bit of a kind of a hopscotch through the science journalism world. I worked at Physics Today, which is a magazine really kind of like communicating about physics to physicists. It's very much a kind of a fairly insider perspective. I worked at Scientific American, which is a bit broader and kind of reaching out to educated people who are not necessarily scientists. Then many years at Discover, which is broader still in trying to bring science to the masses. And my latest job is it's an interesting new experiment. So Aeon is a completely digital magazine and quite young. It's just been around since 2012, and it is really it's kind of it's sort of a work of intellectual passion. It was two academics and publishers in Australia who pulled together some family money and started this magazine basically to write about, to publish the kinds of articles in science and politics and culture that they themselves wanted to read. And again, like many of my favorite publications, it's really about bridging worlds, about sort of taking these very deep perspectives from academia that don't always make it out into the popular world and delivering it to a wider audience, and trying to achieve a somewhat, I feel like we're in a strangely split world right now where people have access to deeper ideas than they've ever had before, and they also have access to more crazy and superficial information than they've ever had before. So I feel like we're always trying to strike a better balance to make sure that that there some of the incredible richness of what's happening in academia, what's happening in scientific research, to make sure that people know that and they can appreciate it and that they can enlarge their lives with it.
Okay, well, let's just move right on. Okay. Let's just move right into, for example, the Juno mission, which grabbed a lot of headlines recently. Tell us a little bit about the importance of the Juno mission and the planet Jupiter.
Well, the two go hand in hand. I mean, what's really Jupiter is the largest planet, and it's not just it's the largest planet. Jupiter is kind of the keystone to understanding how the solar system formed and evolved very, very early on. Jupiter's gravity was really kind of influencing the whole evolution of the early solar system. And there's a lot of evidence now that when the planets were forming, they didn't just kind of like form in the places where they are now. There was a lot of moving around. Like the early solar system was a very kind of erratic and chaotic place. And Jupiter, as the biggest planet, was kind of the conductor of this whole kind of chaotic symphony. So if you can understand how Jupiter formed, you can understand basically how everything was moving around, how water got to the Earth, how Pluto and those other little things got flung out to the outer part of the solar system. Why we have 8 big planets in our solar system and not 2 or 20. There's just some basic questions we don't understand about where we came from and whether there are other solar systems that could support life around other stars. So, so understanding Jupiter is kind of like the key to understanding a lot of that, and that is really the focal point of what Juno is about.
Now, Jupiter is the 800-pound gorilla in our solar system, right?
Yeah.
It outweighs all the other planets put together. And in some sense, it's also like a cosmic vacuum cleaner that vacuums out all the comets, meteors, debris. So isn't it true that if it wasn't for Jupiter, life would be impossible on the Earth, that we'd be pelted with asteroids and comets, and there'd be a gigantic crater where we are now in New York City. So we owe it all to Jupiter, right, to clean out the solar system?
Right. This is one of the really interesting questions, which is, what exactly did Jupiter do? Jupiter is both a vacuum cleaner and a snowplow. Jupiter swept up a lot of material, but also rearranged a lot of the flow of where things went. And one of the ideas is that as Jupiter was moving back and forth in its orbit, that it actually shoved a lot of kind of icy comets and asteroids into the inner solar system. Those are things that landed on the very, very early Earth, and that's where our oceans came from. So there's sort of, there may be in fact two ways that we have a debt to Jupiter. One is that it helped us early on with water and organic chemicals and things that made life possible, and the other is that later on, as you say, it acted as this vacuum cleaner and kind of protected us from getting bombarded. So again, the question is, if you have another planetary system around another star and it doesn't have a Jupiter, does that mean that those planets there are all out of luck, or are there other ways that you can make an Earth? Is this the only way to do it?
Now, Jupiter is also quite radioactive with lots of radio disturbances as you approach it. And many people are startled to find that a lot of the static we get here on the planet Earth actually comes from Jupiter. So the next time you get snow on your TV, static on your AM radio, you can blame it on the planet Jupiter. But that also makes it rather dangerous to get there, right?
Right. Well, it makes it dangerous if you want to get anywhere close, and that's the real challenge with this Juno mission, because Juno is going to get extremely close to Jupiter. Juno is going to get less than 5,000 miles above the cloud tops. So Juno will be closer to the surface of Jupiter than, say, Beijing is to New York. So it can be right there in the thick of it. And that's one of the reasons why this mission is not going to be a terribly long-lasting mission. It's going to last maybe 18 months, because the radiation is very, very quickly going to wear down all the electronics and all the systems on the spacecraft. It's actually built with a titanium vault. The electronics are encased in a box of about a quarter-inch thick titanium, just because without that, the probe will be fried instantly.
Now, also, after the mission is completed, as you mentioned, the probe is going to be sent into Jupiter to die. Now, the previous mission, the Galileo mission, was also sent into Jupiter to die. But some people said, well, it's not sterilized. So even though, of course, most of the germs are going to die on the way to Jupiter, is it such a good idea to send probes crashing into other extraterrestrial bodies that have our germs on them? What are your thoughts?
Well, what happens is you have to make trade-offs of what you want to learn versus how careful do you want to be about not disturbing things. I think the likelihood that there is life on Jupiter or in Jupiter, based on everything we know, the likelihood of that is pretty low. And when you're talking about crashing into Jupiter, you're talking about basically turning this irradiated spacecraft into a flaming meteor. I think the risks you're talking about are pretty low. I mean, that said, the reason that we're crashing it into Jupiter instead of just kind of leaving it there in orbit is that if it stays in orbit, there's a chance that eventually it would crash into the moon Europa. And moon Europa is a place where we do think there's a good chance of life. And you definitely do not want to be crashing into a moon that's it's icy, it has an ocean. It's a place where if there are any Earth germs that manage to survive on that spacecraft, Europa is a much more worrisome place to contaminate. So at some point you you make your choices of, as soon as you go out and explore, there's some risk of contamination. You just want to do the very best you can.
And speaking about the Europa mission, right? Wasn't it the Galileo mission that first began to seriously focus interest on whether or not life might exist on an icy moon of Jupiter? So explain to us, how is it possible you could have a liquid ocean underneath the ice cover of a moon that is millions, billions of miles from the stars?
This has certainly been one of the most exciting discoveries of planetary science over the past 20 years or so. Starting with Galileo in the late 90s, realizing that water is not a scarce thing in the universe. Once you get out to Jupiter and beyond, almost all the moons of the giant planets contain a lot of water. But the thinking was always, these are little worlds that are frozen solid. There's nothing interesting or dynamic about them. But it turns out they have gravitational interactions with each other. They're always kind of pushing and pulling at each other. And what happens is, that it creates friction. It's like if you just kind of like squeeze a piece of silly putty or something and it warms up. These moons are expanding and contracting. They're getting what's called tidal heating. They get warmed up inside. And what we're realizing now is that a lot of these moons, a lot of the small icy bodies have oceans inside. Europa has a big ocean inside. Saturn's moon Enceladus has a giant ocean inside. There's now actually pretty good evidence that Pluto has an ocean inside. And that means, if you're looking for liquid water as a place to look for life, we used to always think, you're looking for the Earth, another Earth. You're looking for, a planet that has continents and oceans and blue skies, and it looks like home. But in fact, what we're realizing is most of the liquid water in the solar system, and probably most liquid water in the universe.
Okay, Corey, we have to take a short commercial break. But after the break, we're going to talk about Mars and the exploration of the red planet. And one day, will we go to the stars? Once again, our special guest today is Corey Powell, science editor at Eon Magazine, contributing editor at Discover, an American Scientist, and his next book is coming out next year called Everything All at Once. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. With us in this hour is Corey Powell, science editor at Eon Magazine, contributing editor at Discover, an American Scientist magazine. And his next book is coming out next year called Everything All at Once, written with Bill Nye, the science guy. Well, Corey, where we last left off, we were talking about the exploration of the solar system. And now let's bring it closer to home. Let's talk about Mars. First of all, the question that everyone wants to know is, have we found any evidence whatsoever of any life on the red planet? Yes or no?
This is one of those really annoying times when I'm going to have to say maybe. By coincidence, today is the 40th anniversary of the Viking 1 landing, the first landing on Mars, and the only serious experiment that humans have done to look for life on Mars. And, the results of those experiments were very ambiguous. I mean, there was no clear evidence of life, but there were some very strange things. It turned out that we didn't really understand a whole lot about really how you look for life. We didn't understand a whole lot about, the chemical complexities of trying to do a science experiment like that on another planet, basically by remote control. So, this is why, you hear these endless headlines of like, NASA's found more water on Mars. They found water here. Life might be there. We have, even after 40 years of exploration and all this different type of research, we still have really very ambiguous information. I think it's pretty clear that if there is life on Mars today, it's probably buried deep underground where there still are traces of water, where there's some warmth, where you're protected from radiation. And you're probably, if the only way you're going to find it is by sending a mission that can drill down deep and it can do very sophisticated research to look for it. So, the frustrating answer is we're not going to have an absolute answer for a long time, and probably what's going to happen is we're going to look more and more places and not see anything. But it's very hard to prove a negative. It's very hard to prove that there's not life on Mars.
Okay, well, NASA has said that sometime in the 2030s, we don't know for sure, but sometime in the 2030s, we may send a manned mission to the red planet. So first question for you is, did you see the movie The Martian with Matt Damon? And what are your thoughts?
What am I, made of stone? Of course I did.
And what are your thoughts? How realistic is it? And how dangerous is it to go to the red planet? What are your thoughts?
Well, look, going there is completely realistic in terms of technology. If we wanted to send, if you gave NASA, let's say, $200 billion and told them, to finish developing all these technologies and, finish developing the space launch system, the giant rocket that NASA is working on, there's no question in my mind we could send humans to Mars, and we could probably do it on a 20-year time scale. The problem is that right now that money doesn't exist. Right now, NASA's whole program of sending humans to Mars is pretty much fiction. It's real in the sense that there are engineers who have a pretty good idea of how to do it, and if it were funded, we probably could do it. But it's fiction in the sense that there's no economic backing and there's no political support for it. So I think in all likelihood, somebody like Elon Musk, who can do it using his own resources and do it because he wants to do it, is actually much more likely to be sending humans to Mars than NASA is, not because they don't have the technology, but because they don't have the will, they don't have the political support.
Okay, and speaking about Elon Musk, the billionaire behind PayPal, behind Tesla Motors, and behind SpaceX, Elon Musk has been making headlines. First of all, he said that perhaps one day, in order to make a paradise out of Mars, we should nuke the ice caps, put hydrogen bombs there. So I'll ask you about that. And the other question is, well, he said that if NASA won't do it, he'll do it, that he'll send a probe to Mars. So let's take a short commercial break. And after the break, we're going to talk about the exploration, not just of Mars, but the stars. Stephen Hawking, my colleague, has come out with an ingenious device to send the first starship to the nearest stars, but it does not look like the Enterprise. Michio Kaku. Once again, in this hour, we have with us Corey Powell, science editor at Eon Magazine, contributing editor at Discover and American Scientist Magazine. And his next book is coming out next year called Everything All at Once. Well, Corey, where we last left off, we were talking about Mars. So, well, what are your thoughts? Of course, science fiction writers talk about one day terraforming Mars, that is, making a Garden of Eden out of the red planet. We even had on our radio waves Robert Zubrin, the founder of the Mars Society, who even has a plan to create a Garden of Eden on the red planet. But what are your thoughts? You think that Mars is ripe for colonization, or do we have to wait a few generations?
Let me break that into two questions. Mars is ripe for colonization? Absolutely, no question. Mars is ripe for terraforming? Not anything close to where we are right now. I mean, I think terraforming is a really fun idea to think about. But let's think about that. We're doing terraforming on Earth right now. We're emitting greenhouse gases. We're doing things that are altering the global climate. Just trying to take control of that process and make sure that it doesn't run out of hand. We're not doing a very good job of that with basically every nation on Earth having a very strong interest in making that work. I think we're very, very far away from actually understanding how you would terraform Mars. But let me say, thinking about the idea of how to do it is actually incredibly important because you learn a lot in the process. And I do think, look, there are caves on Mars where astronauts would have a lot of protection. There are these interesting apparent water flows on the sides of certain craters that indicate that there actually is some kind of water that's available at the surface of Mars. I mean, there are some really interesting things that human astronauts could do to establish a colony there, to really understand whether or not there's life on Mars, to understand what it is to explore the solar system, and to establish a human presence on other planets. You would need to do a lot of that before you can talk about terraforming. But I love that people like Elon Musk are thinking not about what we'll be doing in 5 or 10 years, but what we could be doing in 50 or 100 years. Now, on that time scale, sure, I think there's going to be a vigorous discussion about whether the role of humans is to are we the interplanetary park service where we're preserving other planets, or are we colonialists who are going and setting up human presence on other worlds? I think there's going to be a real debate about that.
Okay, and let's move even further into outer space to the stars. Well, if the Saturn rocket were to go to Alpha Centauri, the nearest star, it would take 70,000 years. So let's take a short commercial break. And after the break, let's talk about an idea circulated by Stephen Hawking and others to send the first starship to the stars. Once again, you are listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, our special guest today is Corey Powell, science editor at Eon Magazine, contributing editor at Discover, an American Scientist, and his next book is coming out next year with Bill Nye, called Everything All at Once. Well, Corey, as you know, my colleague Stephen Hawking made headlines once again by saying that we should go to the stars, not just out to Pluto, but way out there to the stars, using a starship not the size of the Enterprise, but a starship the size of a postage stamp. So could you elaborate?
First of all, let me say, I think this is actually one of the most exciting ideas in space exploration right now. I'm glad to have a chance to talk about it. I mean, the idea is, the entire history of space exploration, really, the entire history of rocketry, going back, 1,000 years into the early rockets in China, it's all been based on this idea that basically, you light some chemicals, the flame goes out a little nozzle, and it makes you move. It's a great concept that's it's very limited and very primitive in a lot of ways. The idea that Stephen Hawking is promoting is a thing called a laser light sail. It's a totally different concept where you attach, as you say, a really, really small probe to a very, very large, very lightweight reflective sail, and you blast it with a laser beam. And the laser beam is actually, it gives energy, it gives momentum to the sail. You can accelerate this thing very, very powerfully, and it has no fuel on board. Basically, you have a laser that's on the ground, or maybe it's in orbit or on the moon, but the laser stands still. You're just zapping the spacecraft. The spacecraft, you can accelerate it to, in principle, 5, 10, even 20% the speed of light, to 1,000 times faster than anything we've ever built before.
Okay, now let's talk about, some of the downsides of the idea. In order to propel it, you need a laser bank capable of generating 100 gigawatts of power. That's 100 nuclear power plants. That's a lot of nuclear power plants aimed very precisely at a postage stamp. So what are your thoughts about whether or not one day we can assemble 100 nuclear power plants to energize this starship?
Short answer, yes. I think if you're doing pulsed power, you don't necessarily need 100. I think you can probably get away with 5 or 10 and some energy storage, and you do very intense energy pulses. If you imagine doing this on the moon, look, the idea of building, let's say, 5 nuclear reactors and a storage system and a solar array on the moon, I'd say ambitious. It's huge, but it's not outside the realm of what we know how to do technologically. How to make the laser sail. You would need a breakthrough in precision pointing. You'd need a huge laser array. You would need a new kind of communication system to get signals back from your little probe. All these things would require significant technology breakthroughs, but they're all, again, based on known principles. We're not talking about warp drive. We're not talking about dilithium crystals. We're not talking about anything kind of make-believe. We're talking about an incredible but realistic extrapolation of things that we know. To my mind, if you were talking about where to put a giant investment to really do it, and it's a human technology breakthrough, this is one of the great places to do it.
And with the advances in computer technology, you could probably put an entire observatory and science laboratory on the postage stamp so that as it goes to the nearby stars, it'll take detailed photographs and perhaps land on one of these planets and send signals back, right?
Well, so again, part of what's really interesting about this concept, again, because there's no rocket involved. The spacecraft is not, it's not sitting on any kind of propulsion system. The spacecraft is really just this little, maybe iPod size or even chip size thing attached to a sail. So the spacecraft could actually be built very cheaply. You could mass produce them. So instead of sending one probe to Alpha Centauri, what if you send 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000? I mean, as crazy as that sounds, almost all the money that you'd be spending is building the laser. The probe itself would cost almost nothing. So you would be sending out giant clouds of spacecraft in different directions, and one of them fails, it doesn't matter. If one of them misses its target, it doesn't matter. It's a completely different way of thinking about space exploration. And you know what? And if it turns out that it doesn't get you to another star, the same technology would be incredibly powerful just for moving around through our solar system, for building a space transportation network. So it's one of these things where, as far as we can take, every step along the way of the technology would be useful and would be a breakthrough.
Okay, and let's also move forward and talk about what we may find with a starship that could then begin to reach the nearby stars. Recently, with the Kepler satellite and other sources of astronomical instruments, we've been able to detect all sorts of bizarre planets circulating around other star systems, right? Triple star systems. Can you imagine 3 stars in a system with planets going around it? Originally, didn't people think that was beyond natural law?
Let me tell you, almost everything that we've discovered over the past 20 years of looking at planets around other stars, almost every step along the way, what we've seen is something that the theorists said was impossible. I think this has been a very humbling experience because you think about how does a star make a planet? It's basically, you just have gas, dust, and gravity. It's just the stuff swirling around, and then some of it falls into the star, some of it makes planets. In theory, the physics of that should be pretty simple. But then the reality of, what does a planet look like? Where can planets be? Which planets could support life? Almost every idea that we had about that, almost every answer we had about that turned out to be wrong. When you actually go and look, there are Jupiter-sized planets orbiting closer stars. There's stars around planets around triple stars. The universe is full of surprises.
Okay, Corey, unfortunately, our time is up. Once again, our special guest today has been Corey Powell, science editor at Eon Magazine, also contributing editor at Discover, American Scientist, and watch for his latest book coming out next year. It's called Everything All at Once, written with Bill Nye, the Science Guy. So, Corey, once again, thank you so much for being on Science Fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much.
Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku.
This is Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we profile the amazing, jaw-dropping scientific discoveries which are revolutionizing our world and touching our lives. And in this hour, once again, we're going to throw the lines open because it's open mic on Science Fantastic. Okay, well, moving right along, let's take the first listener phone call.
This is Blake Steele from Chattanooga, Tennessee, calling from 102.3. I was just wondering, what exactly is radioactive material?
Okay, well, we hear about radiation all the time, but the question is, what is radiation? Well, very briefly speaking, when you smash an atom apart, you break it apart, it's called an ion. But if you smash the nucleus at the very center of the atom apart, you get subatomic particles. And the fragments of atoms and subatomic particles are called radiation. Now, of course, there are many types of radiation because there are many constituents within the atom. The most common form of radiation is electromagnetic radiation. That is radio, television, visible light. All of that travels at the speed of light because that's what light is. Light is a form of electromagnetic radiation. X-rays, for example, are ionizing radiation, which can be potentially quite dangerous and give you cancer because it, in turn, can rip apart atoms. On the other hand, radio is non-ionizing. It does not have enough electromagnetic energy to rip apart the atom, so it is not as dangerous as X-rays. So that's one form of radiation. Then we have subatomic particles, alpha rays, beta rays. They're much more dangerous in certain ways. And they're found, for example, in fallout. If you have an atomic bomb, it releases an enormous amount of X-rays and other kinds of radiation, but it also makes radioactive dirt. So the dirt created by the hydrogen bomb that is lofted into the sky eventually rains down on the planet Earth in the form of radioactive byproducts. That is, atoms that have been ripped apart, which in turn release beta rays, which are electrons, and alpha rays, which are the nucleus of helium. Those potentially could be dangerous. They cause ionizing radiation, which can cause mutations. And mutations, in turn, can alter the very structure of life. And so we have a situation here where, yes, indeed, radiation can be dangerous, but we also have ways of controlling radiation as well. We have ways in which we can measure it, and we have shielding to protect us against radiation. But of course, sometimes it just gets out of control. Take a look at Chernobyl. Take a look at 3 Mile Island. Take a look at Fukushima. There we had reactors which literally blew their lid, like at Chernobyl, releasing all sorts of radioactive debris that eventually wound up in people's dinner table and in people's backyard. And so, once again, radiation can be dangerous. It can harm you, but also radiation can cure diseases. For example, radiation treatments if you have cancer. And the sun itself releases radiation which makes life possible. Sunlight is a form of radiation as well. Okay, well, moving right along, let's take the next listener phone call.
Hi, my name's Charlotte, and I'm from Bradford, New Hampshire. I'm calling to ask if insurance companies and employers are not permitted to discriminate against people with certain genomes that have been identified on the basis of disabilities or what have you. Then why is it that when we talk about children who might potentially be identified in the womb as having certain disabilities, genetic defects or markers, why is it that doctors are permitted to discriminate against these children?
Well, you ask an extremely important and touchy question, and unfortunately the law is not clear on these questions. However, let's break it down into its components. First of all, it costs about $500 to $1,000 to have all your genes sequenced. Personalized gene sequencing allows you to basically get all the genes that make up your body. Now, some of these genes are broken. They're mutated. They don't function properly. For example, for Caucasian people, they have to worry about cystic fibrosis. If you're African American, you have to worry about sickle cell anemia. If you're Jewish, you have to worry about Tay-Sachs. Each of these is caused by a mutation within our genes. So far, so good, right? But now we have the law coming into the picture because, as you know, laws have been passed to try to protect us against the predatory practices of insurance companies that may want to kick you out may want to kick you out if you are predisposed to certain kinds of diseases. For example, Angelina Jolie, the movie star, made headlines recently when she had a double mastectomy because she was very likely to have breast cancer. She had the genes for breast cancer. The doctors told her that she had a very good chance of breast cancer. It ran in her family. So she had to make a decision to have a double mastectomy. But now you ask an even more delicate question: what happens in the womb? Now, for good or bad, it's possible to detect the genes that make up fetuses before they're born. For example, in Brooklyn, in New York, there's even a group of Orthodox Jews that make it possible to have the genome of the fetuses analyzed, and if the fetus has Tay-Sachs, then the parents, not the doctor, the parents have the option of not seeing that fetus to term. So in other words, no one's killing any fetus, but it does mean that parents have a choice. And again, it's not a question of a doctor discriminating against the unborn fetus. It's a question that the parents are given the option of not seeing that fetus to fruition, to birth, because of the fact that that fetus carries the genes for Tay-Sachs. Now, in principle, this may make it possible to eliminate Tay-Sachs in that family tree within just one generation, if everything goes well. Now, what about the possibility of the misuse of this technology? Well, there are two ways in which genes might be altered. First is somatic gene therapy, in which you simply repair the genes of an individual that's already been born. But there's also germline gene therapy. That is, changing the genes that make up the sperm and the egg, and thereby being able to control your entire genetic destiny forever. Okay? Now, many of the people who work in this frontier area say that somatic gene therapy might be okay because, of course, you don't want to perpetuate suffering. For example, Huntington's syndrome. Huntington's disease is a horrible disease where you flail about like a wild person. Woody Guthrie had the gene for Huntington's. In fact, it's even suspected that one of the so-called witches of the famous Salem witch trial actually suffered from Huntington's. And that, of course, probably upset a lot of the neighbors who thought that maybe she was possessed by the devil or was a witch herself. But some people think that no, perhaps she just had a genetic disease called Huntington's. And so why not eliminate Huntington's disease from one generation? That's somatic gene therapy. But on the other hand, more controversial is germline gene therapy, where you alter your sperm and the egg so that your kids and your kids' kids and your kids' kids on forever have that gene eliminated. So once again, it's not a question of the doctor discriminating against certain individuals. First of all, it's a frontier area. The law has not made clear exactly what is possible and what is not possible. But in the best case scenario, it's the parents who have the option. That is, they're given a choice as to whether or not they should perform, whether or not they should see a certain fetus to term or not. Okay, well, moving right along, let's take the next listener phone call.
Hello, Professor Michio Kaku. My name is Mike McCrow in Beaverton, Oregon, listening to you on station 970 in Portland. I was wondering, ancient lava flows have shown that the Earth's magnetic field, because of the alignment of iron, has changed polarity from north to south several times in the history of the world, of the Earth. I was wondering, when this happens, what effect will that have on the Earth's magnetic field and its ability to prevent harm from the solar rays? Thank you.
Well, you ask a very thoughtful question, and you're absolutely right. If you go to, for example, Hawaii or any place where you've had multiple lava flows, and simply dig right into the lava flows, and calculate the direction of the magnetic field, which is very easy to do because you have iron crystals inside the lava, and when the lava freezes, the direction of the North Pole is frozen in the lava. And as the next lava flow comes, the Earth's magnetic field has changed, and you can actually see the direction of the magnetic field changing in direction as you dig deeper and deeper into the crust of the Earth. And then the question is, are we headed for another one? And the answer is yes. We have records going back hundreds of years of the strength of the magnetic field of the planet Earth. Not, of course, scientific, but enough that we scientists can thereby recreate the strength of the magnetic field going back centuries. And yes, indeed, we are due for another change because the North Pole, the magnetic North Pole, does tend to wander. Now, I have to, at this point, make a very strong statement. I'm talking about the magnetic north. I'm not talking about the geologic North Pole. What's the difference? Well, the magnetic North Pole can wobble. It can change because of the fact that there are different kinds of currents inside the Earth which give us the magnetic field. But the geologic North Pole wobbles only slightly. In fact, we think that's where the ice ages come from. Very tiny wobblings of the geologic North Pole affects the amount of sunlight we get over hundreds of thousands of years, and that influences the ice age. But they're different. So when I talk about a pole shift that is going to come in the next few hundred to 1,000 years, I'm not talking about a geologic pole shift, which would, of course, destroy much of life on the Earth. It would disrupt the oceans, the continents, set off earthquakes, and all sorts of stuff. If you saw some of the movies that Hollywood has created concerning Armageddon and Doomsday, you know what could happen if the geologic North Pole were to change. Now, the caller asked a different question, a more thoughtful question, and that is, what happens if the magnetic North Pole does continue to decrease in intensity and finally flip? Is it the end of the world? No. It's happened many times in the past. And after the break, we're going to talk about a planet that did have a magnetic field which was reduced to zero with catastrophic implications. That is the planet Mars. Well, before the break, we had a caller calling in, a rather thoughtful question, stating that, well, yes, the magnetic field of the Earth is gradually changing, and in the coming centuries to millennia, there could even be a pole shift. And is that dangerous for life on the Earth? Well, yes and no. First of all, we're not talking about a catastrophic shift of the geologic North Pole, which would, of course, split the Earth and create all sorts of havoc. We're talking about a change in the magnetic North Pole, which happens every few tens of or hundreds of thousands of years, and it's happened multiple times in the past. Now, we need a magnetic field to protect us against solar flares and the radiation coming from the sun. Now, Mars has almost no magnetic field to speak of. Therefore, without a magnetic field to protect it against the sun's harmful rays, it means that Mars is continually bathed by radiation from solar flares. As a consequence, that's why Mars has almost no atmosphere to speak of. The atmospheric density is only 1% that of the planet Earth. So it means that if you were to take off your spacesuit on Mars, you'd suffocate. And the pressure being so low, eventually your face would actually explode as a consequence. So we, on the other hand, have an Earth with a very large magnetic field. That magnetic field sets up a shield that protects us from the harmful radiation from the sun. And that's why we have a very rich atmosphere on the planet Earth. Then the caller asked a question. Well, if we do have another pole shift, which has happened in the past, what does it mean for life on the Earth? How dangerous it is? Well, it'll be dangerous because solar radiation will be bathing the Earth, But hey, look, it's happened before. We got through it. It may mean, for example, that life hundreds, thousands of years from now may have to go underground. We may have to temporarily live in underground shelters or cover ourselves to protect ourselves from the ultraviolet radiation from the sun. But it doesn't mean the end of the world. So no one's predicting the end of the world, even if we have a change in the magnetic North Pole of the planet Earth. It's happened before, and we got through it. And the strength of the magnetic field of the planet Earth is decreasing. We can actually measure that. We don't know when there may be a potential pole shift or a shift of the magnetic North Pole, but we are talking about something that will happen on a scale of centuries to millennia. In other words, don't hold your breath. Okay, well, let's move right on to the next listener phone call.
Hello, Professor. I was just wondering. I heard you're talking about the universe accelerating. My name is Nathan. I'm calling from West Virginia. And has anyone ever thought the universe accelerating? Because at the far edges of the universe, the unknown area has mass. If it has mass and it has gravity, therefore it's pulling the universe towards itself. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think what you're asking is, well, first of all, the universe is accelerating in its expansion. It's not slowing down like we originally thought. It's actually speeding up. And perhaps the reason for the speed up is, well, maybe there's a gigantic object way out there, an object that is so large that it is tugging on us, giving us the false impression that the expansion of the universe is accelerating, when actually it's only due to the presence of a nearby but very, very massive object. Well, that theory cannot be ruled out. However, it does not agree with the data today. In fact, let's take a short commercial break, and I'll talk about the data today, about exactly what is the large-scale structure of the universe. Indeed, the universe is expanding. Everywhere we look, we see that not only are the galaxies moving away from us, but the farther they are, the faster they're moving. And we once thought that the acceleration was slowing down. Now we realize that it's actually speeding up. And that leaves us with the possibility that maybe one day we'll be headed for a big freeze. The universe will be so cold that even life itself cannot survive. All life will die when the universe itself freezes at absolute zero. Well, at this point, I advocate, and other scientists have discussed it, maybe we should leave the universe. Maybe we should leave the universe and create an interdimensional lifeboat and sail to another nearby universe where it's warmer, and perhaps we can mess up that universe as well as messing up this universe as well. Well, the caller asked a question. Is there a gigantic object out there that is tugging on us? Or that is the origin of this acceleration? And the answer we think is no, because everywhere we look, the universe seems to be uniform. In fact, it is uniform almost to a mathematical precision. When we measure the background radiation that fills up the universe, the remnant of the Big Bang itself, we find that it is remarkably uniform. So whatever explosion created the universe created a universe that is uniquely uniform. In other words, there is no large object out there tugging on us that we are aware of. However, the latest theory is called inflation, and inflation does leave the possibility that maybe the universe could be lumpier than we thought. Perhaps in our sector of the universe we had a cosmic explosion, but maybe, just maybe, Big Bangs happen all the time. Even as you're listening to this radio program, perhaps universes are being created. If that's true, it means like a balloon inflating, there are tiny sub-balloons that are peeling off, and they are also inflating, and that creates a rather lumpy structure. But in all these balloons, in all these bubbles, the universe is still uniform within each bubble, and the universe is either accelerating or even contracting. That's called inflationary theory. It's gotten a lot of publicity. In fact, we had the originator of the inflationary theory, Professor Alan Guth of MIT, on Science Fantastic. He may eventually win the Nobel Prize in Physics for giving us perhaps the most accurate, realistic model of how the Big Bang took place, which in turn predicts there could be other Big Bangs happening all the time. Okay, well, moving right along, let's take the next listener phone call.
My name is Ron, and I'm in Nikiski, Alaska. I'm just curious. I've watched a show on the History Channel about a guy who actually had a concrete building. He made his own little township. This guy defied gravity, but they didn't know exactly how he did it. He lifted blocks by using something natural that would weigh in the tons with no machinery, anything. And I just, curiosity-wise, what you think of how this guy even accomplished that?
To write history, there have been a number of reports, some of them rather convincing, that seem to indicate that people can literally defy gravity. Think of it, people that climb ropes, Jack and the Beanstalk-like, and go to heaven simply by levitating. In fact, the transcendentalists even have a photograph of some of their people meditating, and there they are hovering above the floor. Unfortunately, when people ask to have a demonstration of this in a scientific laboratory, they have demurred. But let me say a few things about what science says about anti-gravity. First of all, the science as we know it, that is quantum physics and relativity, which are the two leading theories of the universe, they do not allow anti-gravity. I repeat, N-O. So it means that all the tricks that you've seen in magic shows and stuff like that are exactly that, tricks. However, when you go to the very edges of science now, then you're talking about, well, there are caveats, there are footnotes that you have to add to Newton's laws of gravity, Einstein's laws, and the quantum theory. First of all, if there's something called negative matter, that is the opposite of matter, not antimatter, but negative matter would fall up. It would have anti-gravitational properties, but we see no evidence of it. In fact, if there was negative matter on the Earth billions of years ago, it would have literally floated away. Now, why are we physicists interested in negative matter? Because if you have enough negative matter, you can violate so many laws of Einstein that you could have a time machine. That's right, a wormhole machine, a time machine, warp drive, all the stuff you see in Star Trek would be possible if we had large quantities of negative matter. Now, to be frank, we see no evidence, I repeat, no evidence whatsoever of negative matter. All I'm saying is that if negative matter did exist, it would break Einstein's laws in a very precise way, such that things would float, things would fall up, not down, that you could get levitation. And if you have enough of it, it would actually warp Einstein's equations so much that it would allow for time travel and warp drive and pretty much everything you see on Star Trek. There's also yet another way of creating anti-gravity, and that is the fact that the universe seems to be accelerating. In fact, the Nobel Prize was given to 3 astronomers a few years ago for this astounding discovery that the universe is not slowing down in its expansion, it's actually accelerating, careening out of control. This means that something is pushing the galaxies apart, and we think that it is dark energy, the energy of nothing. Even nothingness has energy as predicted by Einstein's equations. And perhaps that's the reason why we have an accelerating universe. Well, that creates anti-gravity, because anti-gravity is pushing the galaxies apart. However, to be fair, I have to say that the amount of anti-gravity pushing the galaxies apart is minuscule, tiny, so small you cannot build a time machine out of it, so small that it's of no practical use whatsoever. We do know that between galaxies, however, there's enough of it so that you can, in fact, push the galaxies apart. So that is a form of anti-gravity that we think can exist, but it is extremely tiny. You're not going to be able to levitate off the floor using this kind of technology. So anyway, just to repeat, anti-gravity as seen in science fiction movies is not possible using the known laws of Newton, Einstein, and the quantum theory. However, there are fuzzy areas. If you have negative matter, which we've never seen before, then perhaps anti-gravity is possible. But, well, don't hold your breath. We have yet to find any evidence whatsoever of negative matter. Okay, well, I think there's time maybe for one more listener phone call.
Hello, my name is Verl Potter. I live in Richland, Washington. I listen to you every Sunday night from 8 to 10 p.m. on radio station KONA. It's Kona, which is 610 on the radio. My question is, I heard that all the planets rotate counterclockwise, including Earth, except one, Venus. Someone told me that Venus is the only planet that rotates. All the planets rotate counterclockwise. And I was told that Venus is the only planet that rotates clockwise. Why is that? I'm just curious. Thank you.
Well, you're absolutely right. Venus is an oddball. But first of all, let's describe the solar system itself. We have the sun, of course, at the center, and then we have a disk called the ecliptic plane, a disk that surrounds the sun, and all the planets lie along this disk. Now, inside this disk, all the planets go around the sun in the same direction. I repeat, all the planets go around the sun in the same direction. However, inside each planet, they have their own spin. And if you take a look at the spin of the planet, we find that Venus actually spins in the opposite direction. So in other words, all the planets move in the same direction around the sun in this disk called the ecliptic plane. But inside the ecliptic plane, each planet spins on its own axis. And if you take a look at the Earth, Mars, and Mercury, we find that its spin is in the same direction, but Venus goes backwards. And why is that? We think there probably was a cosmic collision when the solar system itself was first formed 4.5 billion years ago. Well, unfortunately, that's it for Science Fantastic.